America is leading the world in the fight to degrade and ultimately destroy the terrorist group known as ISIL. On Monday, our brave men and women in uniform began airstrikes against ISIL targets in Syria, and they weren't alone.
The president making his case to the General Assembly this week. President Obama is emphasizing his efforts to form an international coalition against terrorists in the Middle East today. But as the ISIS threat grows, we are learning more about other extremist organizations as well, like the al-Qaeda-linked Khorasan group that has reportedly been planning an attack on the United States. Steve Emerson is a terrorism analyst and expert consulting with the FBI on matters of national security, and we welcome you here to our studios today. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve. I've got to get your reaction to what's been developing in Oklahoma. I mean, I'm sure that you are quite aware of the concerns about homegrown terrorists that are reportedly, growing in number in different parts of the country. We just haven't seen recent incidents like this. But from your perspective, what do you think?
Well, I think there have been more incidents that have been reported. There was one in New Jersey where a man who had actually killed 4 people and confessed that he killed them because of his desire to avenge the killings of Muslims by the United States, and that was not reported widely, and the FBI was told to stand down. That was homegrown terrorism. That happened in July. And in this case, there still is an open question, but there's no doubt this guy was a fanatical Muslim radical. It was clear by his Facebook page, pictures. Also, the FBI found in his computer that they seized that he had been looking at radical Islamic websites. He had tried to convert his co-workers. He had made radical statements. Now, the only question is, what made him pop? Was it because he was disgruntled because he was fired? Or was it because he was carrying out calls to avenge, the attacks against ISIS? We just still don't know, but it's clear that the fact that he decapitated someone, that is definitely unique to what ISIS or radical Islam calls for. There are 2 verses in the Quran that call for decapitation, and that's unique to Islam.
Let's talk about, in addition to ISIS, we've been hearing a lot more about the group known as Khorasan, something we didn't really know much about until recently. These are all offshoots from al-Qaeda?
Yeah, it's a reaggregation of al-Qaeda on a much smaller basis. It's got one agenda: attacking the United States, primarily high-tech means through building bombs, primarily through defeating technology on airplanes. And they reacquired the high-tech people who built those bombs, primarily the ones on the underwear bomber in Minnesota and Detroit, the ones who built the cargo bombs going over the United States.
Some say they're more of a threat right now to us here in the homeland than ISIS.
Yes, well, there's no doubt about it. ISIS's agenda right now is to sort of to solidify its base, build a caliphate. Second stage, take over the Middle East, Arab states like Saudi Arabia, sort of create an insurrection, and then attack the West, okay? It has called for attacks against the West, but these are generalized calls, sort of lone wolves. But that's very dangerous, because as someone said to me last night, we are now entering the phase of a global jihad. Australia is experiencing the highest phase of threats that it ever has in its history. And the U.S., or actually Britain now, is the second highest phase. The United States, I'm afraid, is going to be entering that phase very shortly.
What's changed in terms of the recruiting? Why is it so, exciting for some of these young people to go ahead and be part of these groups?
First of all, they're really pre-selecting people now that are willing to die, as opposed to previous jihad wars where anybody could volunteer and carry. And in the arrests that we have seen since 9/11, and there have been hundreds of arrests, 90 convictions for terrorist plots, most of them have been people that have been willing to carry out attacks, not suicide bombings, but rather remote detonations of bombs. In the case of ISIS, these are volunteers that are vetted and vetted twice, once here in the United States or in Europe, and then on the border with Syria, and they're vetted to see if they're willing to carry out suicide bombings.
So it's part of more of an elite group, so to speak.
Yeah, sort of an elite suicide group. And so they're willing to carry out really vicious bombings. And when they come back to the West, either Europe or the United States, that's where they're going to cause the most damage. And that's the biggest fear when the generalized calls go out and say, carry out as many killings as you can, they are willing to do so.
Scary. Steve Emerson, great to see you. Thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome.